Welcome, everybody. Get started in a minute. Hello, everybody. This is a really popular event today, as always is when we've got Alex coming up to speak. It's not his first time speaking at Scribe Academy. My name is John Fagan, and I've got my colleague here, Tracy. She'll be manning the chat for us. The topic is, are freedom of information requests like a box of chocolates? So just kick things off, just introduce Alex and then I'll share the results. So Alex is a partner in the corporate and commercial team at Leathes Prior Solicitors. I've known Alex actually for quite a long time. He loves working with the local technology and startup community here in Norwich. That's how I've got to know him. And also not only is he a partner, but he also specializes and takes a special interest in data protection compliance. So he's the perfect person to educate you guys today. So I'll end that poll now. So we've had 91% of people responded, which is really good. So I'll end that. I'll share the results there with you. And as you can see, the biggest challenge people unknown is what information should be shared or actually withheld when you've got a freedom of information request. And then there in second place is just, I guess, the process of how to handle it when you get that first request, and actually also maybe know if it's a genuine, valid request. And then down the bottom there, how does it relate to UK GDPR? So on that note, Alex, I'm going to hand over to you to enlighten us and educate us on this beautiful morning.
Thank you, John. You always give me the best introductions at these things. I think I need to engage with my personal sort of hype man for when I go out and do these. And morning, everyone. It's a delight to be back for my third Scribe event. I had the joy of talking at Scribe Fest last year and again on data protection earlier this year. I think John definitely owes me a beer now. It's my third one. So no, delighted to be back and have really enjoyed the past couple of events. So we're gonna sort of change it up slightly this time. So in the last two talks that I've done, they've been generally around data protection and the GDPR. You may or may not be pleased to know that we're now going to talk about something slightly different, but very much related. And what I tend to find in practice is there's a sort of a reasonable amount of confusion between the GDPR and Freedom of Information Act requests, what applies when, what do you need to share in each instance, and it can be a bit of a minefield. This is by no means sort of user-friendly legislation, and as an initial warning, in the interest of transparency, this is quite a dense topic, and it's quite a complex bit of legislation. So I'm going to do my absolute best to simplify this as much as possible, to zone in and focus on the things that you're probably going to be most relevant for you in your day-to-day, and also ensure that we touch upon some of those things that flagged up in the poll. And I was quite pleased to see some of the front runners, because those are the things that I'm going to be covering. So I'm going to share my screen. Great. John, can you see that okay?
Nope. Yeah. So I guess you got your presentation running. Just click on share screen down the bottom there on Zoom. Or I can actually, you did send me the slides. So if you're unable to do that.
Give me 2 seconds. Let me try that again. Is that any better?
There you are. Yeah, so you can go. That's perfect. Awesome.
Excellent. Great. So let's dive into what a freedom of information request actually actually is, because obviously this is going to be the cornerstone of what we're talking about. So the Freedom of Information Act request is a request that can be made under the Freedom of Information Act 2000. So this has been around for some time. And crucially, it gives any person anywhere in the world the right to access any recorded information that's held by any public authority. So it's a really, really wide bit of legislation, and gives pretty much anyone access to public information. This was introduced back in 2000, really the driving force to try and create a little bit of transparency with government bodies, particularly where there were things that were being withheld that were in the public interest. So really wide ranging, and crucially, it applies to information held by a public authority at the time the request is received. So I think this is going to be really relevant for everyone on the call. As I'll talk to you about in a moment, it's going to apply to all local authorities, parish councils, district councils, and I suspect some of you on the call will have had to deal with Freedom of Information Act requests in the past and have probably thought, oh, I really can't be bothered to deal with this. What am I going to have to do? And do I really have to respond to it? Just one side note, but it's quite an important one. This won't apply, this bit of legislation doesn't apply to anything relating to environment, information relating to the environment. So any environmental information is dealt with under a separate bit of legislation. I'm not going to talk about that today, but it broadly follows a similar sort of process. So, crucially, who does the Freedom of Information Act request apply to? So, most importantly, as I mentioned earlier, it applies to all public authorities, so all local authorities, the NHS, police, schools, government departments, very wide ranging. One point to note, and for anyone who was on one of my previous presentations around GDPR, there are certain aspects of the GDPR that don't apply to parish councils specifically. Parish councils have been excluded from certain sections of the GDPR. That doesn't apply here. So it applies to parish councils in the same way as all other local authorities, and that exemption doesn't apply. For completeness, it also includes public-owned companies. So that would include trading companies that are owned by councils. So the big one locally is the Norse Group, and any other bodies that are designated by the Secretary of State, the UCAS. That's going to be less relevant here. So I suspect it will apply to most of you on the call. So we then talk about how to handle a request. So if you receive a Freedom of Information Act request, then you need to consider the following things. So there's five key elements that we're going to go through today and that you're going to need to bear in mind. The first one, and probably the most obvious one, is what are the time limits within which you need to respond to a Freedom of Information Act request. That's one of the most important, and obviously the one that could go most wrong. We're going to talk about costs and how much resource you need to put towards responding to a Freedom of Information Act request. We're going to talk about vexatious and repeated requests. So that's when we can effectively say we're not going to respond or provide any information at all. We're going to talk about where you need to give advice and assistance to those making requests, because surprisingly, and it does come as a surprise to many that I speak to about this, actually there is a duty to provide advice and assistance to the person who's making a request, which is normally done through sort of fairly gritted teeth, but nonetheless something you need to know about. And then what the actual response will look like, and if you're refusing to comply, what a refusal notice needs to look like. We're then going to talk in the second part of the presentation around what the exemptions are, which is where it gets a little bit more tricky, a little bit more complicated, and I'll work that through with you. So the time limits for complying with the request are relatively straightforward. So a public authority has to normally respond within 20 working days of receipt of the request. So that is, even if you don't hold the information, even if you are planning to refuse disclosure of the information, you still need to respond within 20 working days. However, if what's called the public interest test, and you'll hear me talk about this quite a lot, I'm going to deal with that at the end, but if the public interest test applies, then that's effectively extended to 40 working days. But that is the long stop date. That's the longest you would ever have. There are some specific rules around schools and a few other institutions, but those aren't going to be massively relevant. But here I've just included them for completeness. But ultimately, it's either 20 working days, or if we're in sort of public interest test scenario, then it's 40 working days. Best practice is to acknowledge a request when you receive it. That isn't a legal requirement, but that's just general good practice to do so. So that's relatively straightforward. We then talk about costs and resource, and it may be quite useful to know that a public authority actually isn't obliged to respond or comply with a Freedom of Information Act request if the request or the cost in complying with that request exceeds what's called the appropriate limit. And you might have seen that phrase used before. So at the moment, and this can change, but at the moment, for local authorities, that's £450. And you might be asking yourselves, well, what does that even mean? How's that going to be worked out? And what effectively the legislation says is that a standard rate of £25 an hour is used to calculate the total cost of the response, regardless of how much actual resource you spend using it, regardless of the actual costs of the staff that are involved in replying to it. There's this £25 an hour rate that's applied. So effectively for local authorities, what we're talking about there is 18 hours. So kind of cutting through all of that noise, what we're ultimately saying is, if it's going to take you longer than 18 hours to respond, you don't need to provide the information. You would still need to respond, as I'll talk to you about in a moment, to confirm why you're not providing the information, but you wouldn't need to provide a substantive response. So you've got 18 hours within which to do so. Now, 18 hours, I suspect, in most cases is going to be enough. But where it applies to detailed historic data, things that maybe can't be found electronically, maybe things that are in archive, you might take the view this is going to take more than 18 hours, and therefore we're not going to disclose the information that's been requested. And under the legislation, you're completely entitled to do so. Along a similar sort of thread, we talk about vexatious and repeated requests. So you can refuse to respond, again, substantively to a request where it is vexatious or repeated. Lawyers and those drafting legislation absolutely love this phrase, sort of vexatious, which I don't think is used in any other walk of life ever. But it's used a lot throughout this
all the time, Alex.
Well, maybe you're the exception, John. But yeah, so as I say, you can refuse a request where it's vexatious or repeated. So what does that actually mean? So the first thing to note is vexatious is a high standard. You can't just, vexatious doesn't equal, I can't really be bothered to deal with this, so I'm not. This is a pretty high standard. You need to consider all of the circumstances around it, including the motive behind the request, but crucially not the requester themselves, but the motive, and the public importance of the information being requested. So whether or not a request is vexatious is by reference to the request itself and not the requester. So that's quite crucial. So just because you don't like someone or because they've been a real pain in the backside for the last couple of years, that actually isn't relevant for deciding whether or not this is vexatious. It needs to come down to the request itself. And I'll give you a couple of examples of this in a moment. The example, the sort of slightly dry example that the guidance says is effectively it's vexatious where there is a deliberate campaign designed to disrupt public authority. So where the where the motivation is to disrupt or to be deliberately irritating, or where it's malicious, that would be the sort of grounds where we're talking about vexatious. And crucially, you can just refuse to respond to the request altogether where it is vexatious. On the flip side, you can also refuse a request where it's repeated. So what that effectively means is you've had fairly self-explanatory, where you've had an identical or substantially similar request in the past from the same person. Someone keeps banging in the same request, where you have previously complied with it, or you've confirmed that the information isn't held and that person keeps coming back, or you get there hasn't been a sort of a reasonable time limit between the two requests. So let's say someone puts one in, you haven't had the chance to comply with it or respond to it, and then someone puts another one in. You can effectively disregard that second one. So I think this is probably best described with a couple of examples. So the first one that sprung to mind was this, and I suspect on what's a sort of relatively overcast day in May, you weren't expecting to see a photo of Father Christmas, but I believe it was one of the councils sort of down in the southwest received this Freedom of Information Act request, which said, what preparations has the council made for an emergency landing of Santa's sleigh this Christmas? Who would be responsible for rescuing Santa? Who would be responsible for rounding up the reindeer? And who would have to tidy the crash site? The council were clearly not in a particularly jolly mood at this request, and responded to say, thank you for your request. In accordance with section 14 of the Act, I will not be providing a response on the ground that it is considered to be vexatious, which I don't think was perhaps particularly in the spirit of things, but nonetheless, obviously that's going to be something that's vexatious. On a more serious example, there was a case a little while ago, 6 or 7 years ago, when an inventor of a medical device, which was called Whiz Upstream, absolutely no idea what that medical device does. They sought information from the MHRA, the regulator of medical devices, on that inventor's competitors. And there was sort of a bit of a conspiracy theory around the inventor thinking that others were trying to put him out of business. The person making the request, the inventor of this device, had a particularly fractious relationship with the MHRA and claimed that they were at war with him. He was trying to get information on competitors' devices and the grounds on which they were being permitted to have this particular license. What the tribunal, which is sort of ultimately the court-like authority where you would take one of these if there was a complaint, what the tribunal said was the conduct of the individual, including their motive, was vexatious, and as a result, the request itself was vexatious. So ultimately, this is a pure judgment call. But if particularly there is a motive, or there is conduct, or if someone is being abusive or aggressive, you are entitled to say, no, we're not responding to that on the grounds that it's vexatious. So that's a potential option for you in the event that you need to refuse to comply with a request. So as I mentioned earlier, there's actually a duty to provide advice and assistance to authorities. And that's effectively in these three scenarios. So where you need further information to identify what that person is actually asking for, what public record they're actually asking for, you are under a duty to go back to them and seek to clarify that. You can't just say, this isn't very clear, as a result, this isn't valid, and we're not going to respond. That unfortunately isn't going to go far enough. So you would need to go back, you would need to say, can you please provide the, can you be a bit more specific about what you're actually requesting? If you don't hold the requested information, but you know who does, and that other organization is a public authority, what might seem quite bizarrely, but the law says you're actually under a duty to point them in the direction of that other local authority. whether or not you'll get much love from that other organisation, I don't know, but that is a requirement. And also, as we talked about earlier, there's this cost limit of £450 or 18 hours. If you think it will exceed the cost limit, but you think you'll be able to refine it to bring it within the cost limit, then you're under a duty to go back and make that case. I suspect you're not going to want to be doing that where you can possibly avoid it. But if it's obvious that actually by cutting a certain section out, a certain part of the request out, you could bring it within the cost limit, you would need to respond to the requester and let them know that, which again seems arguably slightly unfair and quite burdensome on the organisation, but that is how the legislation has been drafted. So what you need to do then, so having gone through that process, having thought about the time limits, having thought about whether or not you can do it within the cost limit, whether or not the available resources there, whether or not it's vexatious, and whether or not you need to narrow down or provide some further assistance to the requester, we're then at the point of actually responding. So what happens when you get a response, regardless of whether or not you're going to disclose the information, regardless of whether or not you think it's vexatious or repeated, is you need to provide a response. And effectively, it's this set menu of 4 options. So just to go through those, either you can provide the information to the requester. That one's sort of fairly straightforward. If they ask for a particular public record, I don't know, there was a big one in the news not that long ago where someone requested how many speed cameras were in operation in the UK, and the government had no choice but to provide that information. It didn't contain any personal data. There were no other exemptions. That one's relatively straightforward. You would just include the information together with sort of a covering letter. Option number 2 is that you write back to the person making the request to tell them the information isn't held. If that is the case, if they ask for something you don't have, you don't need to do anything further. You just need to go back to them and tell them that it's not held. Option number 3 is that you can refuse to confirm or deny whether or not the information is held based on one of the exemptions that we'll talk about in a moment. Or you can confirm that the information is held, but you refuse to provide it. So 1 and 2, pretty straightforward. Letter back with either the information or confirm you don't have it. 3 and 4 are a little bit more nuanced. So where we've got options 3 or 4, where you are effectively either refusing to confirm if the information is held or not, and that's probably going to be because you think that the request is vexatious or repeated. That's going to be the most relevant one there. Or if you're confirming that you do hold the information but you're refusing to provide it, which is where one of the exemptions will really kick in, you need to go back and you need to tell the requester why. You need to provide what's called under the legislation a refusal notice. So you need to go back and say, if you're relying on exemption, and we'll talk about exemptions in a moment, so don't worry if you're sitting there thinking, I don't really know what that means. If you're relying on exemption, tell them what exemption you are relying on and why. You need to explain why that exemption applies. If you believe the request to be vexatious or repeated, you still need to go back and tell them that. So you can't just not respond at all and say, oh, it's vexatious. You would need to respond and say, we believe under section 14 of the Act, as I read out earlier, this is a vexatious request. And where you're responding with a vexatious request, you don't need to go into loads of detail why, but it's good practice to sort of set out a couple of reasons as to why. And then where we come to the public interest test, which, as I said, I'll talk about at the end, you would also need to explain why it doesn't apply if that is applicable, and it won't be applicable, certainly won't be applicable in all cases. Refusal notices can be challenged. So you might find that someone can challenge that, but ultimately if they challenge it, they will write to the ICO, they will complain about your response, And much like with data protection, for those of you who've been on my previous talks, the RCO at the moment are not turning things around particularly quickly. They're not. It's not to say they're not taking things seriously, but they're not immediately sort of whacking people with these humongous fines. So you will most, in practice, you have the ability to sort of correct it if you need to. But ultimately, when you're thinking about responding to a request, you really need to make sure it falls within one of those four categories, and then you need to prepare your response accordingly. So, as I mentioned, in the second half of this presentation, what I want to talk about is the key exemptions, the key grounds on which you can say we hold information, but we are not providing it to you because we believe there's an exemption under the Freedom of Information Act. And this is a little bit nuanced, so do bear with me, but I've set out hopefully in the easiest format to understand, and I've zoned in on what I believe to be the key exemptions. There are actually, I think there's about 25, 30 exemptions. There's a lot. A lot of them are really niche. So I've focused on the three that I think are going to be most relevant for those of you on the call. So the key exemptions, and this is where you can refuse to disclose information that you are holding, is where the information that you're holding has been provided to you on the basis of confidentiality. It's confidential information. You need to protect that information to protect someone's commercial interests or trade secrets. That one's really relevant where you're dealing with private individuals or private companies. I'll talk to you about that in more detail in a moment. And where you're protecting, where you need to protect personal data, and this is where it links in with the GDPR and can be a little bit of a minefield, but we're going to tackle that one in detail. So, key exemptions, confidential information. So I've set out each of these exemptions in a table form. I'm happy for John or someone at Scribe to share these slides at the end, so you've got this as a bit of a sort of aid memoir that you can look at, because as I say, unfortunately, it's quite a dense bit of legislation around the exemptions is particularly complicated. So what we have is in this table what the exemption is, whether or not that exemption is absolute or qualified, and I'll talk to you about that in a moment, when it would apply, and a couple of notes that you need to bear in mind. So for confidential information, this is around where you are protecting information, where the information someone has asked you to disclose is confidential, or you believe it is confidential. This is what's called an absolute exemption. So that means you don't need to consider any kind of public interest test, which I'll talk to you about at the end. You might have a qualified exemption, and if you've got a qualified exemption, it's only valid where you can satisfy the public interest test, where ultimately what that means is where it's in the public interest. So you can rely on this exemption if disclosing the information would mean that you are in breach of confidentiality. So if you've received information from someone that you know to be confidential, and to disclose it to the requester would mean that you breach confidentiality. So it's fairly straightforward. And the key things to note is the information needs to be confidential. And point two there is that information can't be confidential if it's trivial or useless. Now you would think someone's not going to request information that is trivial or useless, but nonetheless, you need to bear that in mind. And it's most likely going to apply where you've received the confidential information voluntarily. Where information is required to be provided to you under, for example, a contract, it is less likely to be confidential, is what the law says. So ultimately, what you need to be thinking, you've received a request for some information. When you think, do I need to disclose it? The immediate question is it confidential? And if the answer to that is yes, then it is most likely that you can rely on this exemption, and you can say, yeah, we're not going to disclose that information. Quick example of that. A while ago, a reporter wrote to Derry City Council requesting information about the city's agreement with Ryanair, and specifically how much Ryanair was paying to the city to use the airport. The council said, we're not going to respond to that on the basis that it is confidential information. The tribunal found differently. The tribunal ordered the information needed to be disclosed because the agreement between Derry City Council and Ryanair did not have anything that talked about confidentiality or confidential information. And as a result, the tribunal said the contract itself wasn't confidential. There was nothing saying that the information passed between Derry City Council and Ryanair, it was confidential. And on that basis, there was nothing to show it was confidential. So if you've got contracts with suppliers where there's things that are going to be confidential, it's really, as a really simple point, it's useful to get something in writing to say this information is confidential. Ideally, that would be in a contract, but something like an email would give you that extra arsenal in your locker to be able to say this information is confidential and therefore we're not going to disclose it. But the key thing that came out of this case was that contracts themselves are not confidential, so they kind of are up for grabs. We then have the second exemption that I'm going to talk to you about, which is around commercial interest. Clearly, if you've put a particular contract out for tender and you've had a number of private organisations tender and they said how much things are going to cost and what their price lists are, those third parties are going to have potentially some damage to their commercial interests if disclosure is allowed. So in this case, you are allowed to withhold information where you're protecting someone's commercial interest or a trade secret. This is a qualified exemption, so it means that you need to look at this public interest test, which I'll talk about at the end. Where it would apply is if either you would need to, responding to the request involves the disclosure of a trade secret, or responding to a request involves disclosure of information that is going to impact on the commercial interests of any person. So that doesn't necessarily mean the organisation that's put in a tender with you. It can include the local authority itself. It can include any third party. So just a quick note there, trade secret needs to have some kind of commercial value. And the owner of that trade secret needs to have taken reasonable steps to keep it secret. If they've been kind of sharing it willy-nilly, I don't think there's any way you could argue it's a trade secret. And for commercial interests, the exemption is only going to apply where there is a link between the disclosure and the likelihood that the disclosure will prejudice commercial interests, have an adverse impact on commercial interests. So, for example, price lists, etc. If there is no chance that those commercial interests are really going to be impacted, then you might struggle to rely on this exemption. So to give you an example, a load of organisations go out to tender. Someone puts a request who is in a completely different sector, has absolutely nothing to do with the organisations that have tendered, would have no interest in their price list because there's nothing they can do with it. Then at that point, you might say, well, there's actually no link between the request and the potential impact on commercial interest. So again, this one's probably the most complicated. It's a bit of a judgment call, but I suppose in simple terms, if you get the impression that someone's commercial impact, someone's price list, something that's going to impact on their business is going to come out as part of disclosure, have this in the back of your mind to see whether or not you can rely on it. And then finally, on the exemptions, personal data. So as I said at the start, there is a little bit of confusion between the role of the GDPR and the role of the Freedom of Information Act request. So you do not need to disclose information that's been requested under a Freedom of Information Act if it involves you disclosing personal information. So that one's really crucial. So for example, if I went out and I made a request of all of the employment contracts and the personnel records at Norfolk County Council under the Freedom of Information Act request, the council in that scenario would be entitled to turn around and say no, because that would involve the disclosure of personal data, names, addresses, salary information, job titles, disciplinary records, all of those sorts of things. So personal data goes on a separate track. It's not intended to be covered by the Freedom of Information Act. If you can disclose something if you can redact a document to remove the personal information, the guidance suggests you're still expected to disclose that. But remember, even if you redact personal information, it might be quite obvious who the person is, depending on what else is in the document. So this is not intended to be sort of some kind of backdoor way to allow third parties to request personal information on other people. That's not what this is intended to cover. And if you get that impression, you are entitled to refuse disclosure. It's also worth noting in that scenario that I've just given you, where I've requested everyone's employment files, you'd probably say that's also vexatious. Motive there is not going to be fair, not going to be reasonable. The other thing to note here is that if you are being requested information by the individual themselves, and they are saying, what information do you hold on me, then that's a subject access request under data protection law. So I talked about that in some detail in my previous talks. Won't go into it there, but just bear that in mind as well. So they're two very separate things. So this flowchart hopefully just gives you a bit of an idea as to what to do where you think there's an exemption. So you need to consider if there is an exemption. If it's an absolute exemption, you can refuse request. You write back, refuse request, that's it. If it's a qualified exemption, and the only one that I've talked about today is around commercial interests, then you would apply the public interest test, which is going to be the last thing I speak to you about today. And then you would need to, from there, decide whether or not, if the public interest test is satisfied, then you would need to disclose the information. If it's not satisfied, you can again refuse to provide that information. So the last thing we're going to talk about is the public interest test, which I've mentioned to you throughout, and is really most relevant when we're talking about exemptions. So if there is a qualified exemption, the main one being this concept of prejudicing commercial interests, impacting on another organisation's commercial interests, then you would need to apply the public interest test. And what that is effectively, it's just a balancing act. It is a question of, if you must disclose the information unless the public interest in applying the exemption is outweighed by the public interest in disclosing the information. So this is just a balancing act. If there is a higher public interest for disclosure, and we'll talk about when that might apply in a moment, if there is a higher public interest in disclosure, then even if there is going to be this massive impact on commercial interests and you're going to be disclosing an organisation's price lists and all of their detailed commercial information, doesn't matter, you still need to disclose. So when we talk about the public interest disclosure, we need to consider a few things. And again, this, as with everything, unfortunately, in the Freedom of Information Act, it's all pretty nuanced. So key things you need to think about is there a public interest in transparency, accountability, public understanding, involvement in the democratic process? i.e., is there a genuine interest from the public to have this information disclosed? So, for example, is it about what the relationship between government and private organisations, which has come up in the news a lot during COVID, around PPE contracts? A lot of that information came out in the news following Freedom of Information Act requests. do the public need to know this information because it's their democratic right? Those sorts of things will point towards disclosure. Is there a legitimate public interest in the issue? So, for example, will it have an impact on the public? Will it have an impact on the public's, considerations perhaps at the next general election? Is there any suspicion of wrongdoing? If there's suspicion of wrongdoing, that would point towards the public interest test being satisfied. So this is public interest and concern, just as a side note, not a private interest of a single or a group of individuals. That's not going to be relevant here. But if there's this general suspicion of wrongdoing, that's more likely to point towards disclosure. So when you are looking, if you find yourself having to look at this public interest test, which, as you'll have probably seen, isn't the most straightforward of things generally, it's ultimately a balancing exercise. It's weighing up one versus the other. So you need to think about how much is someone's commercial interest going to be prejudiced, where you're relying on that exemption, and how serious is it going to be? If this is if it's going to involve disclosing their entire customer list and their order book for the last 5 years, you would say that's pretty serious, and that's going to have a pretty serious impact on a third party's commercial interest. Think about the age of the information. The more recent the information, the more likely it's going to be in the public interest. Think about specific information and the interest in disclosure. If you've got a Freedom of Information Act that's very wide-reaching and would involve lots and lots of general information, you get the sense that someone is just fishing, then it's probably less likely to be in the public interest. Think to yourself, does it add to public understanding or informed debate? And information already in the public domain is more likely going to be in the public interest and less risky for all of you on this call when you need to deal with it. So those are going to be things that's relevant. What's not relevant is the identity and the motive of the applicant. So that's for the public interest test. Remember, if you're deciding whether or not something is vexatious, motive is still relevant. But when you're looking at the public interest test, then you need to the motive is irrelevant. Private interests, someone's private interests, not relevant for these purposes. Even if the public potentially could misunderstand the information because it's very technical or it could be a bit confusing, that's not relevant. So you would still need to disclose, even if you thought to yourself, well, this could be misunderstood, you'd still need to disclose. Even if the public would have other means of scrutiny or other ways to redress the situation, for example, general elections, local elections, etc., that's not relevant. That's not relevant for whether or not it's in the public interest. And the interests of those in other countries, also not relevant. Even though anyone can make a subject access request, the public interest is only the public interest of the UK public, not the worldwide public. So that's the public interest test. As I said earlier, this is relevant mainly when you're looking at qualified exemptions, and mainly the main one being where there's commercial interests of a third party and where disclosure would potentially damage those interests. That is when the relevance of the public interest test is for those purposes. So just to give you a quick example of that to round things off, and this is now the second to last slide. This was a case a while ago relating to Prince Charles and his relationship with UK ministers. So a reporter from one of the broadsheets requested disclosure of correspondence between Prince Charles and UK ministers, which you may have heard of before. It's referred to as the Black Spider memo on account of Prince Charles's handwriting. And there were a number of letters between Prince Charles and the UK ministers that newspapers were looking to be disclosed. The tribunal in this instance found that the reporter was entitled to receive certain information, because it would be in the overall public interest for there to be transparency between the relationship between the monarchy and the relationship between the UK government, which you can see the rationale that it's in the UK public's interest to see how royalty might be influencing government. However, what the tribunal also said is the reporter, and this is I think what ultimately the reporter was looking for, was not entitled to purely social or personal correspondence, because it wasn't in the public interest, in the wider public interest as to sort of public debate, albeit it might be quite interesting for the public, there's no denying that. It wasn't in the wider public interest for the purposes of the Freedom of Information Act. So it's about drawing that line between what's likely to be in the public interest and what's just quite interesting, but actually there's no obvious public interest reason for it. So that was a clear separation between the two and a clear application of this public interest test. So as a final thought from me, this is probably one of the most complicated bits of legislation that I deal with day to day. There's a lot there. I suspect some of you, I've tried as best I can to sort of simplify things and drill down to things that are going to be most relevant for you all, but it is very complicated. So I think what we suggest is send the slides around. So hopefully that will give you an indication of some of those key points. But it's also a case of not panicking. The reality is, and maybe you wouldn't be expecting a lawyer to say this, but the reality is even if you get this massively wrong, you will have a chance to correct it later on. So it's not about worrying too much about it, and knowing that if something's vexatious or if there is an exemption, you don't need to disclose that information in response. So that's all from me. I think we're just going to pass over. I've gone over a little bit. John, I'll pass back to you.
No worries. Thank you, Alex. That's excellent. Really good job at distilling a complicated topic into simple slides there. If you want to unshare your screen, that would be cool. While you're doing that, so I mean, if you get a genuine freedom of information request or subject access data request, then you will have to have, I guess, this scramble. You've got the 20 days to get your data together to return it to the person, publish it to the person that's requested it. And that data can be locked away in maybe multiple spreadsheets. Maybe those spreadsheets have been emailed around the organization. So you might have multiple different versions of the truth. It might be sitting on different machines, PCs, laptops, etc., or people's mobile phones. You might be using systems that make it really hard to get the data out. And then maybe you have to manipulate it because there's certain things you cannot share. So it can be a bit overwhelming if you have to fulfill that request. And I would say one of the good things about using cloud software is that it makes it, you tend to be able to keep all your data in one place. It's backed up data and you backed up daily, and you can access it everywhere. So like as an example of Scribe, you can just go in if you needed to share some data. Let's just click on payments there. It's very easy just to download the data, get it out. You can pop it up into a spreadsheet and then maybe manipulate it there to share exactly what data you need. So anything related to financial data, or if you needed information maybe on an individual, like a company you're dealing with, like Amazon, want to know everything. They wouldn't want to, you can generate a report, share that report with them, or download it. Maybe there's asset registers. Everything, is very easy to get out and download it and share it. And perhaps if there's a freedom of information request. So one recently we built the CRM. So basically that gives a single point of truth on your customers and suppliers. So if it's a subject access request, you can look up that person, do a quick query on them. That's my account there. And then you can see all the related records to my particular account across all applications. So you can see I've got all my bookings, my allotments, receipts, invoices, everything there, tenancy agreements, personal data that's held on file, additional information, uploaded files, agreements, etc. You can upload as many files as you want. And then also you've got all the change history, which is also important. So that's like an audit trail of what has been changed over time related to that individual. So it's all there, easy to get out. So it saves you a lot of time to do that. So if you want to know more about how we can help you reduce your admin overhead so that you can focus on doing the more important things in your job, feel free to drop a yes in the chat there and we can follow up with you. So we're going to now go over to questions, over to Tracy, who's going to be managing the questions.
Sorry, just take myself off of unmute there. So yes, thank you very much again, Alex, for all of that too. So I've had a number of questions that have come through. So the first one I've got is from Jenny Hodgson. She said she had a freedom of information request that stated it's not confidential unless a declaration has been signed to say it's confidential. Could you respond to that one, please, Alex?
Yeah, that's not true. Information can be confidential in any manner of ways. There are various cases over the years, the most interesting one involving the Ministry of Sound, actually, where conversations in pubs, in public spaces can still be found to be confidential. So there isn't sort of some kind of declaration, there's no sort of formality, but obviously what any written document would do would help you establish that it is confidential. Because otherwise it's all kind of up in the ether and you've got to prove why it's confidential without having anything to back it up. Clearly, if you've got a contract that says information is confidential, or you've got some form of signed declaration saying it's confidential, that's helpful, but without it, it doesn't automatically mean it's not confidential.
Great, that's lovely, that makes sense, thank you. I've got another one here from Dewey Jones. She said, if a council receives a freedom of information request, and the information should already be in the public domain and should not require a Freedom of Information Act, such as the ability to see audited accounts for the previous years. Is the council has not completed those audited accounts for those previous years and is currently undertaking the work required to produce them, how would they then respond to that Freedom of Information request?
Yeah, it's a good question. So there is actually a log of published responses to Freedom of Information Act requests online, which is probably quite a useful resource generally and to look at. I mean, what I would do in practice there is respond to say it's already in the public domain and point that individual to the right place and kind of call it a day there. But you wouldn't have an active obligation to then go through all of the full process that you would do if that information hadn't already been published.
That's another useful answer there. Then I've got Mandy Thomas. She said, can any information be released re-recruitment, or would that be an automatic absolute exemption?
It's a good question. I suppose we're obviously into sort of personal data territory. So if someone makes a Freedom of Information Act request around recruitment, that involves actual specific individuals, I think we would say we're refusing to provide it on the basis that it includes personal data. And as we talked about at the end there, that's fine. Obviously, if they were asking more about recruitment strategies, policies, any sort of equality or diversity policies, things like that, then you would still need to provide that because that's unlikely to fall within one of the other exemptions.
Lovely. And then going on to Rose Love. So she was handed 30 years of paperwork from a previous clerk and not in any particular order. The council and clerk used personal emails before she started and set up the council emails. So can freedom of information be denied based on the fact that the information requested is from before her time, but she's got no access to the previous clerk's email? And going through all the paperwork would obviously take more than that 18 hours.
Yeah, so I think you'd probably have two grounds on which you would refuse. I think actually what you would say in those circumstances is the local authority doesn't hold that information. Because if it's on a personal email address, and just as a sort of a side note, I do appreciate, given resource, it's not always easy to set up sort of, specific council council dedicated email addresses, but it can cause issues where personal email addresses are being used, particularly around these sorts of things, and probably more so around data protection in actual fact. So that's just as a side note, but in those circumstances, I think I would be saying we don't hold the information because they're held by an individual who's no longer connected with the council. And failing that, you would say it's going to take more than 18 hours to gather that information. We don't know, we can't locate the person. So I think there would be good grounds upon which you would be able to say we're not responding. And I think I would be minded there to say we don't hold the information. So obviously, if an individual who was previously either employed or associated with the council is no longer, then I suppose you'd say that's not information being held by the council or by the local authority. And I think you'd then say we don't hold it. On the other point, can I refuse to disclose on the basis that it was before my time? No. So you wouldn't be able to refuse to disclose just on that basis. But if you're not holding information, you can't access the information, then you would be able to say we don't hold it.
I think she's saying she's actually got the 30 years worth of paperwork, so we've got it as paperwork copies, but it's a lot of paper.
Right. So if you've got all the information in paperwork, I think I would probably be looking to say this is going to exceed the cost limit, and because I think going through 30 years worth of hard copy documents probably is going to take realistically, longer than 18 hours, so depending on what those documents are and how long they are, etc. But I think that's then, in that case, what you'd be relying on.
Lovely, thank you. So another question from Jackie Matthews. She says, an ex-councillor has requested Freedom of Information real application made from the Parish Council for an award. The application was completed online, although I did keep screenshots for reference with future applications. I believe I shared this information to the council whilst he was a councillor. Do I forward this information, or as it was for my benefit, do I not forward it?
Yeah, so I suppose it would depend on the nature of that screenshot and what the award related to. I suppose, and what the motive is for getting that information. I suppose you might be potentially in sort of, if someone requests one specific document for a specific reason, and you believe that motive is perhaps untoward, then you may well be able to say it's vexatious. However, if the information is relatively sort of innocuous and you're holding it, the view might be just to disclose it anyway, because sort of what's the harm in doing so?
We're up to time now. Thank you very much, Alex. Really appreciate. We're getting some lovely comments there. Appreciate your talk, very useful. So if everybody can show their appreciation by waving their hands, and that would be nice. Thank you, Alex. Much appreciated. So we're going to call it a wrap. We will be putting this online so that you can see it. We'll do our best to document the questions and the answers. We'll write a blog post on that. But otherwise,